ahead and I'll get started. So today we wanted to talk about transparency, reproducibility, and impact, and open scholarship is essentially what we're talking about. And it's interesting, we modified this presentation from an existing openly shared presentation, but we shifted the focus a bit because that original presentation really situated this discussion in terms of open science. And we really wanted to acknowledge the fact that a lot of open practices can inform scholarship and research more generally, much more broadly than just the sciences. So certainly we've seen a lot of initiative to open science up, but it's not limited to science. So a lot of what we're talking about today can apply to research across disciplines. So that was kind of our rationale for doing that. And maybe we'll just go on to the next slide. I thought we should just introduce ourselves. So my name is Cara Bradley. I'm the Research and Scholarship Librarian at the University of Regina Library. And my involvement with open takes a variety of formats. I'm involved with the open textbook program, open educational resources. I'm on a committee that sort of oversees that, looking to make teaching resources more openly available and save students money accessing those resources. And then more on the research side, I've become quite involved with open access publishing and talking to folks about what their publishing options are, depending on who their potential audience is, who do they want to be able to read this, what are the financial considerations or constraints they're working under. So that's kind of where I've intersected with open scholarship. Maybe Kaetlyn, did you want to just speak briefly to your role and interest in this?
Sure. So I'm Kaetlyn Phillips. I'm the data services librarian here at Archer Library and Archives. My role within open scholarship is it's not always fully open because I work on the data side of things. And what we really try to encourage is making data available to the public and to other researchers, but not necessarily making the data fully open. So one thing I really advocate for is what's called open metadata. So we're not taking your research data and putting it out there for everyone to access, but we are taking your descriptions of what your research project is, the variables you might have assessed, the format your data is in, the publications it's tied to, and most importantly, how to get in contact with you so people can talk about your data, and making that openly available as part of open scholarship and the dialogue among researchers.
Thanks, Kaetlyn. And Christina.
Yeah, I'm Christina Winter, and I'm the Copyright and Scholarly Communications Librarian at the Dr. John Archer Library and Archives. My main interest with open scholarship is just understanding the copyright components to it. And in part of my role, I help faculty, students, and staff kind of understand their copyright rights and obligations, as well as helping individuals to understand how they can make their work available open access, and kind of what are some of the copyright implications around this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we're going to, I guess this is kind of a disclaimer almost. This presentation is kind of to trigger your curiosity and introduce you to the broad scope of things that fall under the umbrella of open scholarship and open research. Get you curious about it, but it is a huge topic. Even as you just heard when we introduced ourselves, we've all kind of have different facets of open scholarship that we really engage with and work with regularly. So it's a big topic, but this is sort of your taster. So we'll get started thinking about open scholarship. And Allison, I don't know if you have any experience or knowledge with this idea of open research, open scholarship, or is this quite new to you?
This is all very new to me.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what any of it is, but one of my objectives for my fieldwork is to find out more about research and things. So I'm excited
Awesome.
to hear more.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So if we go to the next slide, there's lots of definitions out there of open access, open research, open teaching open scholarship. So I pulled one definition here, and comes from UBC, and it talks about open scholarship being the application of open practices through teaching, learning, research, and the scholarly environment. And it gives some examples of things that would sort of fall under that open scholarship umbrella. So um, Christina knows a lot about this, the use of copyright licenses that grant permission for others to freely use and reuse, redistribute, or build upon your scholarly work. That is sort of a facet of open scholarship. Facilitating collaboration using technology. That again is something that opens scholarship up to build connections and involve more folks. Making research processes, data, and code transparent to increase reproducibility and accessibility of research. And you may have heard about the reproducibility crisis in science, where there's often research done that hasn't been reproduced or can't be reproduced. And open science and open scholarship provides a way forward in the face of those kinds of issues. As I mentioned, I'm also involved in the development of open educational resources on campus, which are teaching resources that are open and freely available to students in particular classes, but also anyone out there who wants to learn more about a specific topic. And this continues on the screen. It talks about the fact that social justice is sort of a fundamental underpinning of the idea of open scholarship, making scholarship more equitable, more inclusive, and more available to your average citizen than it has traditionally been when everything's been locked behind paywalls and sort of almost feels like at times kind of done in secret. And pedagogical practices. So we're also seeing a lot of movement in terms of teachers, professors, really engaging their students in creating materials, helping to direct the way that the course goes, and engaging in meaningful activities. Oftentimes that takes the form of experiential learning type opportunities as well. And then connecting and engaging with communities and the broader public. So the open scholarship, as I sort of alluded to, is this broader term under which a bunch of things sort of fall: open access, open research, open science, data, all forms of openness in the scholarly and research environment. Today, we're going to focus primarily on sort of that open research piece as opposed to the open teaching and learning piece, and then also talk about open data. That's really Kaetlyn's specialty, and copyright and the implications of copyright and publication decisions for the openness of research as well. So let's start with a short story, which may sound familiar to those of you who have been involved in research. A researcher intends to answer her research question by proving a certain hypothesis. So, of course, she's going to collect her data. She's going to come up with a methodology. I guess she'd reverse those, come up with a methodology and collect data. Perhaps writing and modifying some code to analyze that data and saving everything on her laptop, occasionally backing it up, I would hope. When she has some results, she writes and submits her paper to a journal. And she might include her data with that submission. A growing number of journals do want to see the data on which you're basing your research assertions and conclusions. But that researcher probably does not include her code when she submits that data. Then time passes. As we all know, this can be a matter of weeks. This can be a matter of many, many months while you're waiting to hear back from a journal, and you'll get those anonymous peer reviews back. People have read that manuscript and provided input on it. And then our researcher would revise her paper to satisfy those reviewers. She might modify the code that she wrote earlier, and then she'll resubmit to that journal. More time passes. Again, this can be a matter of weeks. This can be a matter of months. Dare I say years. The paper is eventually published. It might include a link to an online copy of her data, but the paper itself is behind a paywall, and only people who have personal or institutional subscriptions to that particular journal will be able to read it. So do you see any issues in that process? It is sort of that that basic process of conducting research. When Kaetlyn and Christina and I look at this, we certainly see there's issues, there's potential for issues related to reproducibility and trust. So it feels like a lot of that research is almost being done in a bit of a black box. It's hard to know what has been done. If you wanted to reproduce that research, you may not have enough information to be able to do so. It's also calling upon the reader to place a lot of trust in that researcher. And many, I would say most times, that trust is probably warranted, but there are also times when that trust isn't warranted. Another issue that stands out to us is the lack of full disclosure and openness. So we see this often with things like the skewing of literature towards positive results, where, you know, if something, a study is conducted and there isn't, it doesn't show some sort of effect, then often that publication or that data, that knowledge is never shared more widely. You know, and there's a lack of disclosure and openness about what has gone on. Selective reporting is something else. Another issue is equitable and timely access to that research. And in many cases, research that's conducted at universities is, at least in part, publicly funded. A lot of research conducted in Canadian post-secondary institutions is funded by the federal government through the Tri-Agency. And as well, university staff and professors' salaries are paid in part by tax dollars from the provincial government. So it's publicly funded research, and it makes sense that the community, both the academic community and broader society, should have access to that research to benefit from it since they have funded it. And in our scenario we just looked at, we're not really seeing that because that research is published behind a paywall that is only available to those that have a subscription. And, you know, I think that also it, you know, publishing a work behind a paywall not only shuts out some of the readership, but it can also kind of disadvantage the individual researcher in terms of, you know, the more widely their research is disseminated, shared, talked about, built upon, the better that is for that researcher's career. And it also helps them to make connections and engage in collaborative research going forward. And then another big concern is safekeeping of work. So, you know, we heard about that researcher who's storing all this on a laptop, maybe doing maybe backing it up periodically. And, you know, we know that laptops fail and software changes over time too. So what does that mean for the longer term access and safekeeping of that work? So let's see how we can season this story with some open scholarship sauce, and address some of these issues in the same process. In the process, and I'm going to turn it over to Kaetlyn now.
All right, so let's consider a revised approach. So our researcher, she collects data and designs her methodology along the way. She also writes and modifies some code to analyze that data, saying everything to her laptop, occasionally backed up by her department. That's our original situation. A revision that adds some open scholarship is the researcher pre-registers her study and prepares a DMP, or a data management plan. And I would be the person here on campus that you would get in touch with on making a data management plan. It is also becoming a lot more common for funding agencies to request a simplified data management plan with your funding application. Our researcher could also create a version control repository of her work, for example, GitHub. This is especially useful because she is writing some code to analyze her data, and version control is huge because if anyone ever wants to reproduce this researcher's work, they would need to have the correct version of the code. It also means if our researcher wanted to go back and reuse that code, she would have the correct version. As data are collected, she uses the repository to safekeep the data. And as she perfects her analysis, she pushes changes to her code to that repository, and the repository becomes her hub for collaboration. So we've really opened up the data collection process, and we've removed the black box that Cara mentioned by just doing some planning and using a repository. So let's talk about pre-registering your study. So pre-register, pardon me. A researcher posts his or her research hypothesis and the planned research design or methodology in a publicly available registry. So, for example, as predicted or Open Science Framework, OSF, and that is pre-registration, and that happens at the beginning of the project. In some types of research, this is incredibly normal and common. So, Cara and I have both done work in what is called evidence synthesis research. And part of the process of completing evidence synthesis is you pre-register your project to a repository hub. So it is something that has existed for many types of research, but it's becoming more normalized. With pre-registration, we are sharing the research design and plans beforehand, and that complements disclosures and openness of research outputs. It does take more time, but it also saves time down the road. And this mostly applies to confirmatory empirical research, but it does not disclose exploratory and/or observations research. So this is something that can apply to all types of research. So why should we do this? Well, there's a lot of benefits for it. It rounds out the body of evidence by creating a paper trail of unpublished studies in the area. So again, going back to the example of evidence synthesis, one of the reasons why that type of research has a pre-registration process is if you're thinking about doing an evidence synthesis project, which can be a large amount of work, you can actually go and see if someone else has tackled your subject. So it can help determine like if this is a project worth replicating or starting by having that paper trail. It also reduces the risk of data mining and other cherry-picked presentation of facts. And data mining is something that is really noticeable when you look into the reproducibility crisis in science. And if you just start looking into different types of science areas where if a type of research tends to be trending, I, for one, always see this when I look into studies on wellness and studies of like how to create changes in diet and establish healthier habits, where a lot of studies will eventually be corrected or redacted because we found out the researchers were cherry picking. So this reduces that by pre-registering the study. Pre-registration also makes open data and disclosure more effective, allowing the cross-check of published claims against the original research plans. So again, it actually improves the research process and strengthens the honesty and respect for the research process. And it encourages scholars to carefully think through their design, increasing research quality and reducing waste on funding and poorly conceived projects. And one of the reasons we can do this is by planning the management of research data. So let's talk about research data management. So this is a general term that covers how you organize, structure, store, and care for the information used or generated during a research project. And planning how your data will be looked after is really important. It's becoming more common. Many funders now require data management plans. So in Canada, the Tri-Agency is slowly rolling out a data management plan requirement. I believe most tri-agency applications do have a section where you have to talk about your research data management if you don't have to supply a data management plan. Internationally, the EU, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent the US are a little bit more advanced than Canada on research data management practices. So if you do ever end up working on an international research team, you might have to learn more about this. Research data management affects how you deal with information on a day-to-day basis over the lifetime of a project. And it also helps you determine what is going to happen to your data in the longer term, and what you're going to do with it after the project concludes, because all research has value and all data has value. So we don't just want to put it on an external hard drive or stick it in a filing cabinet to gather dust. We actually want to see that research expanded upon most likely. So data management plans. These are documents that describe how data is generated, used, elaborated, and organized, how data and data subjects are protected. So there is a part where you think through all the ethical and commercial implications of your data, how the data code and ancillary elements are described and documented, how the data will be stored and secured, and how long it will be retained, how dataset authorship and credit are assigned, and how data is preserved and under what terms can be shared. So this is, I might date myself by saying this, but I always think of your data management plan as like, if you're doing like old school essay writing, and you might have learned this in school or might not, you might have been encouraged to make an essay outline. And a data management plan is kind of like your research outline, your data outline. So it's really important in helping you think things through. And it's also really important to remember that data management plans, they're living documents. So if you make a data management plan and things have to change, like let's say you get more funding than you expected, or you get less funding than you expected, you can go back and modify your plan. It's not set in stone. It's very much intended to be a living document.
Caitlin, I kind of think of data management plan as being similar to a research ethics board application, right? And that it's kind of it forces you to think through your project before you do it and have a plan for it. And it, as you said in one of your slides, it takes time, but I don't know that it takes more time, because it's the steps you were going to do along the way. It's just you're doing them up front, and oftentimes maybe saving yourself some errors that are going to cost you time in the process. Would you agree with that? Or
Oh yeah, definitely. Data management plans are basically like front loading your research project because again, you are thinking through it. They're also incredibly useful too if you're working on a team, because then as a team, you have to think through all these things, like even things like how are we going to name our files, which might not seem like a big deal until you have a team, you might hire students, you don't have a consistent way of naming the files, and then you get all this data from different people and you have to make it all work together. So that it's something that it will actually save you time ultimately because you're front loading it, you're thinking it through. Even like solo research. So if you're doing your research project on your own, it's useful because again, you do have to think through those things and it can save you time if, say, you have to do an ethics application. So if you've made a DMP, you've probably already thought a lot about the ethical implications. You might have to expand upon them a little bit more in a formal REB application, but you've kind of got that groundwork done. So let's talk about version control, which is keeping track of changes in your work and opening up your process. So I quite like this comment because this also ties to something that I talk about a lot with researchers and students, which is be very careful in how you name your files. So this one shows version control and also the importance of having a good like file naming convention, because we've all been there. You start working on something, you get comments, you do another revision, you get more comments, so on and so on and so on. It's very possible to have multiple nearly identical versions of the same document. We all do this. So version control system benefits, they keep track of changes for us, creating different versions of the file in a repository. So online services such as GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket allow repositories to be kept in sync across computers, facilitating collaboration among different people or different use. Another thing too about GitHub is you can create your own little like personal instance of it. I know sometimes people are worried like having their stuff out in the open with the ever looming presence of AI, but you can actually create your own little personal version of GitHub that isn't connected to everyone else and still get the version control benefits. Keeping an open track of changes in your projects allows others to understand your research process, which builds trust. So version control is like an unlimited undo. You never lose anything and you can always roll back. So let's go back to our researcher. So in our original situation, our researcher has some results. She writes and submits her paper to a journal. She might include her data, but she probably doesn't include her code. In our revised version, as soon as the data are stable, she stores the final data set in an open repository. So here on campus, we have Borealis Dataverse. Some other common examples of repositories are Cadmus or Zenodo. And with that, it is assigned a persistent identifier, which in most cases is a DOI or digital object identifier. And that means it can be tracked and linked to other things like your journal publication. When she's happy with her paper, she posts a version in a preprint server, such as Social Archive, with links to data and code to invite feedback from peers. This kind of opens up the review process. She may post several revisions before finally submitting her paper to a journal, and she may share a reproducible version. So, by registering and storing your data in an open repository, you kind of make them first-class citizens in the scholarly communication landscape. So they have that persistent identifier. They are findable, which is really great if you also want to amplify your own research. They can be curated and preserved. So again, it's not just data sitting in an external hard drive or just on a laptop. It's someplace where you can keep track of it and where others can also see it and you can work on preservation. It can be cited. One thing that can be quite common is using secondary data for a research project, which would be you're using someone else's data. You are supposed to cite it as that's where your data originally came from. And it also means you can be the data can be reused and you will be credited for that. So it really does improve the communication among scholars by opening it up. But one thing we always need to remember with data is our rule is as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So you don't have to put all the data out there for someone to just instantly download. You can put in sort of like checks and balances if you think your data might be a little bit sensitive, or if you're working with human participants and you want to protect them more. So that's why, like, as I said in my intro, I'm a big advocate for open metadata, because I want you as a researcher, I want your work to be findable and discoverable, and I want that scholarly conversation. But we also want to protect your data if that's something that we need to consider. So when we talk about data and putting data in a repository, we talk about the FAIR principles. So we want to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So findable, that's where that DOI comes in. That's where just putting your data or metadata in a repository is useful, because now people can find it. They can search your name, they can search your publication. You can link your publication to your data. Accessible means that it's a little bit easier to get access to the data than beyond contact the author. So usually it's easier to update contact information. In some cases, if you are comfortable with that, you can just put your data there for people to download, and they just have to maybe like leave their contact information for you. Interoperable means that trying to put the data in non-proprietary formats. So for example, if you've got your data in a spreadsheet, you put it in CSV format over Excel format, because CSV works in multiple types of spreadsheet softwares. Excel, you need to have Excel. And we want to make reusable. So that often means we will look at Creative Commons licensing and discuss like what are the terms you as a researcher want to put on your data so someone else can use it. And now we're going to turn it over to Christina.
Thank you, Caitlin. So now we're going to talk about how preprints and working papers are your friends. So what exactly is a preprint? So preprints are versions of papers that are shared before an official submission and eventual publication in a journal. So some common preprint repositories are Archive for physics and SSRN for social sciences. Um, Preprints are extremely common in certain fields. So physics would be the example that I'm most familiar with. And it is, again, also becoming a fact in the social sciences. So I know a lot of researchers now really like posting in SSRN and getting some feedback before they submit their publication to a journal. What's really nice about preprints is that they carry a timestamp, which basically means that this creates a precedent for the article being published. So someone can't publish on the same topic before you because there's the timestamp there. It also provides immediate access to the research. Another kind of advantage of preprints is that it creates kind of a trail of your research. So you can see how the publication has changed over time, which ultimately makes your research more transparent. It's also free to access, I should point out, which is a really nice option as well. Also, while waiting for the official peer reviews, the research is already out there, and it's available to be discussed, visible and active for the entire academic community. And I don't want to just say academic community. I guess I should just revise that to say community. Other issues with preprints that make it a bit more advantageous is that maybe not all research always you may not always want to publish it in a formal publication, so you're not encountering some of the issues that you might with a more formal journal publication, such as being accepted into a journal, embargoes, so delays in getting access to that research, and it's immediate. It is important to remember, though, that there are some kind of limitations to preprints. They are not peer-reviewed like other journal publications, but they are really great for quickly disseminating research findings and great to solicit feedback from the community. Also, as well, preprints servers tend to issue different DOIs, so then later more formal publication. It is important, though, if you are going to be posting your publication to a preprint server, but you are thinking later on that you might want to submit it to a journal publication, I do recommend that you check your journal's policy on preprints before you do this. Some journals don't allow for articles to be submitted to a preprint server prior to publication, while others do, and they may also have requirements such as taking down the preprint from the server once the article is posted. And an example of this would be the some guidance is the International Committee of Medical Journals has some guidance on overlapping publications. So there's different terminology that's used in different disciplines. So now we're going to go back to our revised approach. So the journal sends her anonymous reviews. The researcher revises her paper to satisfy them. She might also modify the code she wrote earlier and resubmits. But on our revised approach, the researcher most likely would follow a similar path. But since the researcher has already published their preprint and posted it on a preprint server, the research is already out there in the world making an impact. If the researcher changes her code, again, the history of changes is tracked in the version control repository. And then lastly, she might have submitted to a journal that adopts an open peer review approach, which is a bit different. This way, in an open peer review, I've seen different definitions, but it's not as kind of closed and anonymous as the more traditional peer review process. So continuing on, the paper is eventually published, and as Cara mentioned earlier, this can take a very, very long time. It might include a link to an online copy of her data, but the paper itself is behind a paywall. So only people who have a personal or institutional access will be able to read that. And I just wanted to, I guess, pause to kind of expand upon the issue of a paywall. I think sometimes outside the university, people aren't familiar or maybe not don't know necessarily that a lot of the research that's published is really only accessible to people who have institutional credentials. So if you're a student, for example, at university, yes, you have access to all this great research, but once your time at the university ends, you no longer have access because it's limited to authorized users. So this really restricts how other individuals, members of the community can access that research. But if the paper is published, possibly in an open access journal, and includes a link to the preprint, to her data, her code repository, and the study for pre-registration. This makes it easier for other researchers to use her work as a starting point for their own research and to validate her findings. Her research is transparent, reproducible, and impactful. So now we're going to take a little look into our first peek of open access publishing. And really throughout this publication process where we started with the preprint, that really is the first step. So a common definition of open access is that open access is the free, immediate online access to the results of scholarly research and the right to use and reuse those results without most permission barriers. And really what they're referring to, permission barriers, really is the copyright piece. So when we're looking at our open access options, let's go back to our publishing workflow with that definition. So we started with the preprint, which was deposited into a repository. And typically the works that are in the preprint version, as we mentioned before, this is prior to peer review. So there's different terminology that's used, but a lot of the time, this would be considered the submitted version. So this is the version that goes to a journal. So once a journal goes to, once the publication gets submitted to a journal, this is when it actually goes through the formal peer review process. And at that point, there's typically some revisions made to the article, then the researcher submits those corrections. So after that process, that's when the journal, after the peer review process and the corrections are made, this is what's known as the postprint, or another terminology is the author's accepted manuscript. So a lot of journals now understand that there are requirements for open access. So in most funded requirements, this is the version of the article that needs to be deposited into an open access repository. Again, there may be an embargo, and what an embargo is just a time period before an article, if it's published in a closed access journal, it needs to be behind the paywall until it can be released. So this could be 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months. And then once the article has kind of gone through the final kind of copy editing typeset process and it's formatted. So this is what most people are familiar with, the finer publisher's version. This is when it's published, and that's what's known as the version of record. So this version of a journal article can typically only be shared if it is made available open access, if you're publishing in a fully open access journal, or if it's in a journal that's like such as Gold, for example, where you may be publishing, paying for an APC or a hybrid journal. So this kind of moves to an author pays model. So kind of onto that, is open access going back, I was a slide ahead on my own slides. So just some kind of benefits wanted to highlight about open access is the first one is the immediate visibility and dissemination of one's research. Just thinking back during especially the height of the COVID pandemic, a lot of researchers did post their results to preprint servers. They couldn't wait necessarily for the formal publishing process because sometimes that can take years. So this is where it's really nice to share some results quickly and immediately. Another kind of common way to do that, also if it's timely topics, I know mentioned before, but working papers would be the same type of thing. They're published on a server. and again, looking at timely topics. Other benefits, of course, of open access are equitable access to knowledge, and Cara had mentioned that earlier. We had talked about having content behind a paywall. And again, this becomes really important, especially if you want your research to be made available to the community. But even taking a step back further, not all institutions have the same institutional access to journals. It's extremely expensive for universities to access this research, and different jurisdictions around the world may not be able to access this content because it's behind a paywall. So by publishing your work open access, it's free of those, especially financial barriers. Again, accelerated discovery, as we mentioned before, especially if there's timely research, you don't necessarily want to wait a couple of years. And open access allows that, just speeds up the process more. Again, Kaetlyn and Cara mentioned greater transparency, also increased possibility to be cited. There's quite a few studies which mention that works that are published open access tend to be cited more. And I would think part of that reason would be is that there's increased access to that content. So again, if you're only publishing in uh, journals that are behind a paywall, that limits the amount of individuals that can actually read and access that research. But if it's open access, that opens up your audience. Also, public enrichment. It's not just researchers who look at academic research. We could think, for example, journalists may want to access that content. Again, they most likely don't have access to an institutional membership. So this could be, the research could be used there, public policy makers, community members, just it really opens up the possibility. And I think I mentioned maybe a slide or two ago, a lot of national funding bodies, as Cara mentioned before, a lot of research conducted at universities is funded by taxpayers. So they really want taxpayer-funded research to be made available to the public. If it's behind a paywall, the public can access that research. So there's increasingly moves with funders to have that as a requirement, that if you accept federal dollars, for example, you need to make, it's just a requirement of that funding body. Again, greater opportunities for collaboration. I think, again, publishing your research out there, putting everything through an open scholarship model, again, increases opportunities for collaboration, because if your code, for example, is open access, someone might want to reuse it, so you could collaborate that way. And again, greater potential for impact as well. So that could be through your academic career or to the community or wider world. So this is kind of taking a step back about is open access free? That is a little bit of a complicated answer. So open access is typically free, especially to the reader. So if we are thinking about an open access publication, it is free at the point of read and use. So you should not encounter any barriers to accessing that content. But nothing is free in absolute terms. And there are different models to fund open access. So one which I had mentioned before is the considered gold open access. So these are typically known as moving the, I guess, payment and funding of open access to the, instead of the reader paying for it, it shifts it kind of to the author side. So in this way, the author typically is paying an article processing charge to have their work be made available open access. So the publication fees can be quite expensive. I think we've seen, maybe Cara might know about this. I mean, most of the time they're in US dollars as well. You know, $6,000 is not, I think, uncommon sometimes to make a work open access. If you are thinking about considering this, please check with your library, because a lot of libraries have negotiated agreements with publishers for open access discounts. So there may be 100% discount to something like a 10% discount. And it does depend on the journal title and what has been negotiated with the publisher. Another model as well, which would be platinum, diamond, open access, and then that's kind of subsidized cost. But then there's also something which is mixed. So Pure J would be an example of that. So there's different kind of funding options. And I should mention as well, another way to make your work open access, and if you have any questions, we do have a mediated deposit service at the University of Regina, where if you have a list of publications and you're wondering how you can make them open access, you can email us, we can review your list, we look at the publisher agreements, and then we can figure out which version of your paper can be deposited in University of Regina's nonprofit institutional repository or space. And now I'm going to turn it back to Cara.
Whew. So I would think you're getting the sense, just by the amount of the number of things you talked about, of how big of a topic open scholarship is and how many different facets of it there are, different ways to make your research process more open. And, I think being realistic, not every solution is going to work for every researcher, but I really do encourage researchers to sort of look at this sort of menu or array of ways that you can make your work open, and start to think about what might work for you. And so I think, just to sort of sum up about open scholarship is not a goal in itself so much, but it's a means to achieve a spectrum of goals. So, thinking about what are your goals as a researcher. When I think of people come to me and they have questions about open access publishing and should I do this, or what considerations should come to play when I'm making decisions about where to publish. And my first question is, who are you trying to reach with this publication? So if you're a faculty member in social work and you are publishing research that you're hoping is going to help social workers working in the field, a lot of those social workers will not have subscriptions to expensive journals. So in that case, open scholarship could become a means to achieve that goal of making your work openly available for those who are practicing in the field. So there's different sort of tiers of benefit. I think for you as a researcher, open scholarship makes your work more transparent, more visible, more likely to be cited, because the more people who have access to that work, the more people are potentially going to be citing it. It can help you to better engage with the research community and increase collaboration. I think open scholarship is particularly important when we talk about community-based research too, opening up that process, working with community members through openly, transparently throughout that whole process of conducting the research, from figuring out what is the exact question that we need to answer here, all the way through to sharing data as you're collecting it and making that final publication, those final results available to that community as well. So the research community foster knowledge and discovery and reduce barriers, increasing trust. You're not sort of asking people anymore so much to blindly trust you when they can look under the hood and see what it is you've been doing. And for society at large, as I said, I think there's a lot of benefits through opening scholarship up. It can boost innovation and economic growth, can save public money. And if people are doing things and it's all sort of secretive and it's published behind paywalls, there's not necessarily a lot of knowledge about who's done what, and so work is unnecessarily conducted again, perhaps when an issue has already been settled, or they're starting from square one, where they could be starting further down the process and building on existing work. And I really see open scholarship as having potential to contribute to making a better world. And recognizing, I think, that there are challenges. So why are we talking about open scholarship? Why isn't scholarship itself sort of synonymous with the kinds of practices that we've talked about? And I think there are lots of cultural, legal, technical, professional barriers that are gradually being eroded, but certainly, to be a realistic to be realistic. There's a lot of us who have grown up in a tradition where this has not been our practice to open up our work, and it feels kind of weird to do it. So there's a learning curve, and it's a process of becoming comfortable with this sort of lens of viewing and conducting your research through this lens. We also hear people say, I don't have time for this, or what do I get out of it? And again, I think that's a matter of thinking specifically about your particular research and what it is you're trying to achieve, and what pieces of this open scholarship process will help you to better achieve those particular goals. I already have the tools I need within my own community. I gave away my copyright and I can't do it legally. This is a big challenge that Christina and I have had a number of questions about over the years. People publish an article or publish a work, they sign away their copyright to the publisher, and then later on in their careers want to come back to that work and build upon it or commercialize it or do other things with it. And they may have made decisions when they close that work by publishing it behind a paywall and signing their copyright over to the publisher. They may have closed that door on themselves inadvertently. So, but times are changing rapidly, and I think more and more we're seeing more conversations about open scholarship, open access. I used to feel like we would go out and try to convince people of the virtue of openness. And I feel now like more and more we have people coming to us trying to figure out how to achieve their goals through more open scholarships. So I really see it spreading in academia broadly, and probably in realistic terms, the single most powerful factor in that is changes in the funders. If you increasingly funders are saying, if you want this money, this is what you need to do. You need to open these things up. So they do have a lot of clout, but I think we really are starting to see things change. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. We've just scratched the surface. As I said, it's a big, complex sort of landscape, but the three of us are certainly happy to take any questions either here or if you want to follow up with us after this presentation, or if it's 2 months, 6 months, a year down the road when something comes up. Sometimes that's the best time to ask those questions. Specifically what it is that that you're trying to achieve. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of the three of us. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions or comments before we wrap up today? Seeing none, I think we'll call it a day, but we do hope to hear from you, and we welcome your questions. And we're always excited when people reach out and are interested in talking about strategies for making their work more open. So thanks, everyone.